Chapter 9. The Band of Adventurers. Jacen, Janae, and Benny arrived to Vishan's hut and were greeted by Chino. The manservant was standing next to a mule-driven wagon where several bags of supplies were tied and laden. 2 standard pack horses were at the head of the train and were also laden with bags of provisions, standard hunting bows, and a quiver of arrows attached to each saddle. "Welcome, travelers. We leave in 20 minutes for the forest," said Chino as he greeted the trio. Just then, the tall fighter Euclidean walked up to the group and introduced himself. "Greetings," said the muscular man. "I am Euclidean, and will be leading the group to find this man's kidnapped wife. His name is Erimus." He gestured to Erimus, who was in the process of arguing with a young girl. "How could you have disobeyed me?" Erimus shouted at the young girl. The young girl set her face in a determined way and said, "I can help you, Papa, and I want to find Mama just as much as you." The young girl turned her back on her father and walked away. Erimus huffed in anger and strode away in the opposite direction, making angry gestures to the air and speaking to himself. The group watched him stride away when Euclidean turned back to the trio and said, "As we enter the forest, there will likely be many dangers encountered, many life-threatening dangers to be sure." Jacen and Janae nodded, and Euclidean continued. "With a wagon filled with supplies, we will surely be set upon by bandits once we enter the forest and leave the protection of the city behind." "Why are we traveling with a wagon then?" asked Janae. Euclidean turned to her, gave her an appraising look, then said, "I want the bandits to attack us, so we can capture one and force him to tell us where to find the horse riders that match the description Erimus has given me." Jacen smiled and said, "Sounds like a dangerous gamble. What if we encounter a group that is too large for us to handle?" "That's one of the main reasons I hired you," said the tall fighter. He slowly walked around the small wagon of supplies and spoke over his shoulder to Jacen and Janae. The large bounty hunter continued, "One of the benefits of forest encounters with brigands are the spoils that can be found along the way. This is the main reason Vishan fronted the cost of the venture, knowing that it would be possible to make a small fortune from our travels." He stopped his survey of the supplies, then looked over at Benny. Stepping in close to Jacen, Euclidean quietly said, "If the simpleton slows us down, he will be left behind to fend for himself." Jacen looked into the tall fighter's eyes, and after a moment's pause, he said, "I won't ever leave him behind." Euclidean paused, then said, "Fine, but if the man's wife dies because of our time to find her, it's on your head." He looked at Jacen's staff for a moment, then asked, "Do you know how to use that thing in a fight?" Jacen said, "I can hold my own in a scrap." This reply caused Euclidean to laugh and move away to speak to several hired men that wore simple armor but carried bows and short swords. Nearby, Chino explained the men were additional hired guards provided by Vishan to help guard the caravan. "Having the appearance of guards will increase the perception of value of our supplies to any would-be brigand. We are expecting to be set upon quite quickly, so be prepared to protect the members of the caravan if we are attacked," Chino said to the group. After checking in with Janae and Benny, Jacen called out to Chino, "We'll join you after we gather our supplies." Then he, Janae, and Benny moved away from the wagon of supplies. As the small group walked away, Chino asked his master, "So what do you think of them?" Euclidean replied, "They will be useful in our venture, I think, but there is something dangerous about the one with the long hair." Chino said, "I too noticed a peculiar energy coming from him, almost like a coiled fighter just waiting to explode into a flurry of combinations." Euclidean considered the words of his manservant and thought that they were an apt description of the man that he now knew as Jacen. He had also noticed the wear on the ornately carved hunting bow the young girl carried, which suggested much use. He had a hunch she would be of value to the protection of the caravan in their upcoming venture. Of the simpleton, he thought he would most likely perish from being left behind, and with a shrug and momentary pursing of his lips, he moved off to make the final preparations to leave. The group gathered together at the appointed time they had agreed to set off and leave the city. Dusk approached as the band of travelers exited the city from the western gate to travel the small cobbled road to the entrance of the great western forest. Euclidean and Chino both rode upon pack horses and led the single mule-driven wagon in which the supplies were kept. Erimus, Hope, and Benny rode within the wagon, and the travel was slow-going enough for Jacen, Janae, and Vishan's 3 armored guards to walk alongside the moving craft. Euclidean hummed a melody to himself as they rode out, and would be seen to scan the area around them, pausing his tune every so often to listen quietly. As the group approached the ever-present canopy of trees of the forest that blocked out most of the sky above, Euclidean addressed the group. Everybody be ready to fight at a moment's notice, as we are expecting to be attacked by brigands at any time. Unfortunately, I must recommend that you kill or be killed, as that is the motto of the thief in these parts, the large fighter finished. Euclidean paused, then spoke again. Be sure to leave 1 or 2 alive if you can, as I will need to question them to find out which direction to find the horsemen who kidnapped Erimus's wife, he said. Erimus shuddered when Euclidean said this, and he reached out to take his daughter's hand in his own. Hope resisted, then relented to snuggle closer to her father, who put his arm around her in a semi-protective embrace. Janae prepared her bow and quiver as Euclidean addressed the group. She glanced at Jacen to see how he was faring. Jacen was busy pulling out a piece of ancient-looking armor from his travel pack, which he quickly slid onto his left forearm. The forearm piece was made of some unknown metallic metal weave that glinted in the moonlight. Small etched runes that matched those on his staff could be seen on the outer ridge of the armor piece. As Janae watched him, she saw the armor appear to shrink against his arm until it seemed to fit perfectly. Jacen looked up at it and made eye contact with her. Janae smiled at him, and he smiled back to her as their leader continued his directions. Euclidean spoke to those who rode in the wagon next. When the fighting begins, get down and try to stay out of sight. If anyone outside the members of our caravan try to get to you, use one of these, and dropped a small pouch into the wagon which landed at their feet. Erimus opened the bag, which held several round sacks tied loosely with string. The farmer was just in the process of asking what the sacks were for when Chino called out to the group. "Look ahead!" he cried. The wagon train came to a slow halt as the participants looked to where Chino was pointing. In the roadway ahead of them, as many as 12 torches could be seen being held aloft by rough men on foot. The men were covered in dirty outerwear, and many could be seen carrying daggers, short swords, and bows. The large group of men slowly approached the caravan until they were a dozen feet away. A muscular and swarthy man who wore a mixed match of leather armors stepped forward and addressed the travelers. He held out a wickedly long dagger and gestured with it like a man conducting an orchestra as he spoke. The dark bandit said to the group, "Now you see's here, we'll be taking everything but your lives if you want to leave here unspoilt." He continued, "Step down off them horses and throw down your weapons on the ground, or every one of yous dies." Euclidean and Chino stepped off their horses and simultaneously drew their short swords from the sheaths on their backs, then took up defensive stances side by side. Jacen moved out away from the wagon and slid his staff free but kept within reach of Janae, who strung an arrow to her bow. Bringing his concentration to bear, the armor piece and staff began to vibrate in a resonating matter. He quickly looked around his group. As each member of the traveling group watched the bandit leader, he realized he would need to reserve his usual fighting tactics as a last resort, as he did not want to call attention to his ability to cast demonic magic. The whispers within his mind became louder as the wind spirits in the area frenetically offered their usual services to him. Quietly, he shook his mind clear of the whispers and commanded them to do nothing for the moment. Erimus, Hope, and Benny crouched low in the wagon, and the farmer remembered the bag that Euclidean had given him. With shaking hands, he reached down, opened the pouch, and gathered several of the weighted pouches he had seen earlier into his hands. The 3 guards were perspiring heavily, but all of them began to notch arrows and take aim when the swarthy bandit spoke again. He gesticulated with the dagger as he addressed the group. "Now you sees here, everyone thinks they can defend themselves in a scrap, but they don't ever know how traumatic brutality can be. Ain't that right, Salty?" he asked a nearby companion who wore similar clothes. The man addressed as Salty intoned his agreement with the bandit leader. He was missing his nose and upper lip in a jagged tear of ruined skin. Lines of snot dribbled from the openings of his exposed nasal passages, and his upper teeth were very prominent as the man laughed in a nasally way. The leader stepped forward toward Euclidean and gestured with his dagger as he spoke a third time. "Now you see us here." Just then an arrow appeared in the bandit leader's shoulder, causing him to cry out and stagger back. Everyone looked in surprise at Janae, who was busy notching another arrow to her bow, and with steady hands. She quickly took another aim at the group of the bandits. The stunned bandit leader screamed for his men to attack, who all began rushing forward in a hostile manner. Several dark and deadly missiles were fired at the travelers as the onrush of bandits ran across the small distance that separated the groups. The missiles missed hitting anyone in the group, but several of the arrows struck the wagon with a loud plunking noise, while others whizzed past overhead. Euclidean and Chino both sprang into action and ran straight at the oncoming bandits and engaged the closest brigands they each encountered. Using a practiced combination of blocks and swipes, several of the bandits were immediately cut down by the deadly attacks from the two trained fighters. The area around the travelers took on the sounds of battle and attacking men. Euclidean and Chino moved their way in a concentrated attack and sliced and hacked their way through the initial bandits in their path. Soon the bandit named Salty and the brigand leader had both been cut down in the onslaught of their attacks. Several of the bandits had taken up defensive positions and fired black-colored arrows at Euclidean and Chino, who jumped behind nearby cover as the missiles bore down on them. In the din of building noise, Janae took careful aim and fired into each bandit that she could see, carefully and calmly drawing another arrow from her depleting quiver each time she fired. Many of her arrows struck the bandits who fired arrows at the travelers, slicing into unprotected thighs or necks, and many of the men fell onto the ground as her missiles struck true, allowing Euclidean and Chino to resume their attack. As she took aim, an arrow from the bandit group flew by her own face, scratching her cheek as it had traveled so close. This caused her to stumble back and momentarily lose her balance. As the bandits rushed at the group of travelers, Jacen quickly scanned the area around him and saw the mass of men were ahead of the group and there did not seem to be any immediate danger from behind their caravan. Seeing that Janae had righted herself and had resumed firing arrows, he rushed forward to aid Euclidean and Chino, who were both fighting side by side amidst the brigands. His armor and staff vibrated and an electrical hum was heard coming from the etched runes as he ran forward. Several arrows flew towards him in the dark surrounding, and Jacen deflected the closest of the oncoming missiles by knocking them out of the air with the spin of his techno-staff, or blocking the missiles with his vibrating forearm gauntlet. The armor easily absorbed the impact from the flying missiles, causing the spent projectiles to deflect uselessly away from him. As he engaged the first two bandits, he swung his staff in a concentrated spin of attack. The weapon created an electrical sound in its spin, and as he blocked the attacks from the bandit's short swords, each impact with the vibrating weapon caused a loud sound of electrical discharge. Jacen cried out a battle cry as he attacked, and the short swords were knocked out of one of the bandits' hands by his techno-staff. As the two bandits he fought were both disarmed, Jacen swung the staff weapon in a series of quick attacks that concussed each of the bandits in various areas of their body. One bandit fell to the ground with a grunt and painful moan as several of his ribs were splintered. The other bandit screamed as the head of the staff struck his hand, shattering the bones within the folds of flesh. The man's hand was pulped to a jelly-like consistency as he fell to the ground and writhed in pain. Jacen grinned as the man fell to the ground screaming. Just then, two bandits broke past Euclidean and rushed toward the wagon. The young fighter began breathing quickly in excited anticipation. He intercepted the men and savagely struck each one down with his staff, blowing out great bursts of sound from his mouth. His body was swirling in various combination of attacks and swipes with the strange humming staff weapon. The two bandits were soon incapacitated on the ground, one with a broken thigh bone and the other with a concussed head injury. The man with the broken thigh bone began vomiting onto the ground due to the pain of his injury, and the bandit who had been concussed was crawling around aimlessly as a large bleeding knot was seen rising from the side of his skull where the staff weapon had struck him. Jacen began to laugh in a deep and dark voice as he watched the man crawl around on the ground. As Jacen was laughing, two remaining bandits began running toward the wagon. Hope screamed as the two brigands approached. Holding the small pouches and shaking hands, Erimus screamed out to Euclidean, "What do I do with these bags?" During a momentary pause in his fighting, Euclidean cried out, "Light the fuse and throw it!" With reluctance to leave the fighting, Jacen shoved his staff back into its makeshift holder and picked up a nearby torch that had fallen on the ground. He ran over to Erimus, who lit one of the strings from the flame of the torch, which began to fizz and burn towards the small pouch. "Throw it!" yelled Jacen. Erimus chucked the pouch toward the bandits that had almost reached the wagon when a loud explosion went off. The air was suddenly filled with a black smoke, causing the bandits nearest the explosion to begin coughing and retching. Jacen left the torch with Erimus and ran toward the retching bandits. Once more pulling out his master's metallic staff weapon, Jacen struck each of the nearest bandits down, and each one was left incapacitated on the ground with a broken shin. His breathing picked up again in excited anticipation as he looked around wildly for another enemy to attack. The whispers within his mind screamed at him to be released to join the battle, and their lustful sensations drove him on. With careful effort, Jacen commanded them to silence and began taking slow, deep breaths to bring his senses back under control. Euclidean and Chino were in the process of dealing with the final 4 bandits and were soon down to the last 2. Euclidean, Chino, and Jacen surrounded the remaining 2 bandits, who soon threw down their weapons onto the ground and surrendered with their hands held out in front of them. As Chino guarded the bandits with his sharp-edged weapons, Euclidean momentarily cleaned his dripping short swords and stepped over the bleeding bodies of several dead brigands as he approached the remaining 2. He looked into their eyes for several counts, then walked out to the unconscious bandits that were still alive. Making sure the remaining bandits were watching, he took his dagger and stabbed each of the unconscious men in the chest, then walked over back to the captives. The 2 bandits recoiled and turned their heads away as each of their former comrades were killed before their eyes. Erimus flinched at the sight of the brutal slayings, and hope hid her face in his chest as he put his hand protectively upon her head. As Euclidean approached the final 2 bandits, with no warning, he brutally stabbed one of the men through his gut, causing the man to scream hideously and grab his stomach, which gushed blood onto the ground at his feet. The man slid to his knees and fell over and began to moan and writhe in pain. Soon he stopped moving and could only be seen to twitch until that too stopped. Janae was standing next to Benny, and she turned her body away at the grotesque murder and covered Benny's view with her body. Her hands and arms shook slightly as the man's dying screams came to an end. Jacen stood close to Janae and had taken a quick, deep breath each time the killings had been done. His hand gripped his staff weapon more tightly, and he began to take slow, deep breaths. He could not take his eyes off the scene of the murder, and he slowly licked his mouth as he watched Euclidean approach the final man. Euclidean leaned in close to the remaining bandit and held the point of his blade at the man's gut. The bandit's eyes opened in fright, and urine began to stain his leggings when Euclidean spoke to him in a quiet and controlled manner. "What is your name?" Euclidean asked the man. "Ropley," the bandit said in a shaking voice. Euclidean replied, "Ropley. Yesterday a group of horsemen took a farm woman into the southern part of the forest. They wore matching windanas with crosses and rode wrapped horses. Who would this gang belong to?" The frightened bandit spoke in a shaking voice. "Tat be Barbarous and his crew." "Barbarous, you say? I hate the man already," said Euclidean. Stepping away from the whimpering bandit, Euclidean picked up the dagger the bandit leader had held earlier and brought it over to the bandit they held captive. Using the dagger and gesture as he spoke, Euclidean imitated the dead bandit leader and said, "Now you sees here, you're gonna tell me where to find Barbarous and I'll let you live." As the frightened bandit provided a description to Euclidean and Chino of known hideouts that Barbarous used, Jacen finally brought his breathing under control and returned his staff to its holder on his back. He walked over and began connecting with the rest of the travelers as Euclidean continued speaking to the bandit Ropley in quiet, measured tones. Janae was standing next to Benny, who was in the wagon, and quietly looking at the dead bodies around them, while Erimus was holding his daughter Hope and shielding her eyes from the gruesome scene around them. The 3 guards that had been sent by Vishan could not be found and appeared to have run off back to the city when the fighting had started. Jacen approached Janae and asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded and wiped unshed tears from her eyes. "Those were the first men I ever killed, and I didn't think it was going to feel so bad." Jacen nodded in sympathy and gently took her into his arms. She leaned her head against his broad chest and shivered in his embrace as he remembered the first time his own actions had caused the death of someone. When he had turned 21, he had manifested his demon familiar Vel into his own realm. On their 3rd night together, they had just finished having intercourse in a hamlet forest late one night when they were set upon by 3 hooded men who carried clubs. Jacen had quickly jumped to his feet and had grabbed his techno-staff as the 3 men rushed in at him. Vel had blended into the nearby forest and had ambushed the men right as they had gotten close to the campfire. Shaping her hands and tail into terrible edged weapons, she had slashed one of the attacker's arms clean off his body, causing a bloody arterial spray as the man screamed and dropped his club. With a demonic scream, Vel plunged her forked tail into the man's chest, and with a swirling motion of her nubile body, had lifted his form and had flung it away into the dark forest around them. Just then the man's companion struck Vel full in the back with his club, causing her to scream out in pain and momentarily fall to the ground. The 2 remaining men began pounding on her body with their clubs, bringing screams and whimpers from Vel, who had shaped herself into a defensive form designed to take the least damage. Even so, small bruises could be seen forming on her skin as the rough men repeatedly struck her with their clubs. Just then, a roaring noise filled the night air, causing the men to stim and look around to see what had caused the awful noise. Walking towards them was a hulking, muscular man whose eyes were blood red. It was Jacen. A trickle of blood was seen to be staining his lips, and the metallic staff he carried was dropped to the ground as he suddenly launched himself barehanded at the bandits. The first man brought his club downward to attack the enraged man that ran at him. Jacen had blocked the blow with his forearm, bearing the full weight of the man's attack, and immediately ripped the club out of the man's grip. With a furious strength, Jacen brought the stolen club down onto the man repeatedly in a murderous arc that struck the man's head until it was a pulpy mess. The remaining bandit struck Jacen with his club across the back, causing Jacen to grunt and momentarily stagger. Just as the bandit was about to bring his club down upon Jacen's head, jagged piercings erupted from his chest as Vel stabbed him from behind with forked fingers and tail. The man wore a momentarily shocked look upon his face as he slid away, and the forked edges of Vel's hands pulled out of his body. He fell to the ground unmoving next to the wet remains of his companion's squashed head, and several pools of blood began spreading away from his injuries. With the final bandit dead, Jacen's rage had soon bled away, and he had gathered the wounded Vel into his arms. With deep concentration, Jacen summoned his internal energies and willed the energy into Vel. The succubus sighed as his energy poured into her. She lightly stroked her lover's face as she felt his great love for her within their telepathic bond. After a time, she stood before him completely healed just as the morning sun arose. Jacen was exhausted as the battle lust ended, and from the transfer of energy he had given Vel. He sleepily laid down at their nearby campsite and ordered Vel to guard him while he slept. He had fallen into a deep sleep that lasted many hours and had awoken refreshed to see a roasting rabbit Vel had caught and prepared for him. Jacen was brought back to his embrace with Janae and remembered how it had felt to kill the man who had attacked Vel. It had felt good to give in to his secret violent tendencies, and he had killed many more men in the 2 years that had followed. He reflected to himself how good it had felt to defend the caravan as he held the young huntress close to his chest. Just as he went to embrace her more firmly, a scream rent the night air, causing all but Jacen to start. Euclidean stood up and cleaned off the dagger that he had used to gouge out one of the remaining bandits' eyes. Chino could be seen wrapping a bandage around the man who was quietly weeping. After the bandage was applied, Chino walked the man away from the group and set him on the path in the direction of Maronia. Janae ran over to Euclidean and shouted, "Why would you do such a thing?" Euclidean turned toward her with a stoic expression and said, "I told him I would let him live, and I have kept my word. Now please do your part and help us gather and search these bodies for the spoils of battle." For several minutes, Jacen, Euclidean, Chino, and Janae performed the grim task of searching and moving the dead bandits out of the road into the nearby forest. After the bodies were cleared, they took stock of their findings. A large bag of silver coins had been found along with several pieces of golden jewelry, trinkets, and usable weapons. Several quivers of arrows were also found, and Janae replenished her own quiver of arrows that she had used up in the brief encounter. The unusable weapons were thrown into the pile of bodies that had been made on the nearby side of the path. Euclidean added up the tally and told everyone what their share of the loot was minus Vishan's fee. He said, "Speaking of Vishan, we will share words about his worthless guards when we return." He paused, then said, "Our friend the blind bandit has revealed where we can most likely find the road that leads to one of Barbaros's hideouts. We will camp for the night and head that direction at first light." The booty was locked into a small chest and placed on the travel wagon, and the small group moved some ways away into the hamlet of trees to set up a camp for the night. The assassin watched from his hiding spot as the group left the pile of corpses by the roadside. As their coach drove away, he looked and saw the bandit stumbling back toward Maronia. Drawing his dagger, the assassin silently chased after the man.